Yes.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your time, and we are very grateful that you have joined us for this press conference. We appreciate your time, and we're going to get straight into it. My name is Jordan Hill-Lewis. I'm the DA's Shadow Minister for Finance, and obviously I'm doing this press conference from home. And also joining me from their respective homes is my colleague, the Deputy Shadow Minister for Finance, Dr. Dion George, and our Shadow Minister for Public Enterprises, Khaleb Kachalia. Now, colleagues, what we are doing today is we're launching something, an online tool that we call our Economic Reform Tracker. And I want to just give you a little bit of context about what this is. Firstly, it's important to say, ever since Cyril Ramaphosa was elected president, he has promised wide-ranging economic reform. And we have consistently said to him that we are actually keen to support that economic reform program. And that whenever there was serious progress in implementing that economic reform, that he would have our full-throated support. There have been countless plans and promises around this economic reform agenda, and countless promises around the urgency and necessity for quick implementation and progress on this reform agenda. Indeed, South Africa actually has something of plan fatigue. We have an embarrassment of plans all around how to fix the economy. There is almost unanimity on how to fix South Africa's economy and get it growing. In fact, it is quite extraordinary the extent to which broad sections of South African society now agree on exactly what needs to happen to fix our economy and get it growing. Even traditional opponents of the reform agenda, for example, labor unions like COSATU, agree that there has to be some rectification of the size of the public wage bill. For example, I just use that as one example to show you how much unanimity there is in South Africa about the reform agenda. The one place there is not unanimity is, of course, inside the governing party. And that has been the cause, the reason for the incredibly slow progress. In fact, in most cases, no progress on the reform agenda. There is total policy paralysis inside the governing party. And so when the president often speaks of what he calls social compacting, what he really means is not a compact or an agreement across society, because as I've just explained, there already is that agreement across society. What he means is actually agreement inside his own party, and that has sadly been absent in the last 2 years. So we've been thinking, how do we continue to place the reform agenda at the front of public discussion and on the parliamentary agenda? And we came up with the idea of this economic reform tracker, which helps with one easy to understand online tool to hold the government's feet to the fire on the promises that they have made on economic reform, and which we believe are absolutely essential for the growth of our economy. More than that, not just a summary of progress made to date, but also a list of the action steps that the DA can proactively take to help the reform agenda make progress and to keep the pressure up to make progress on the reform agenda. Now, just before I get into the statement, the final introductory comment that I would make is that even before lockdown, South Africa's economy was in a profound crisis. Lockdown has had a devastating effect in exacerbating that crisis. What is needed now more than ever, in fact, the only way, the only chance that South Africa's economy has to recover from this crisis is if we do engage in a wide-ranging program of economic reform as soon as possible. It is beyond urgent. There is an incredible amount of suffering, a growth in poverty, a huge explosion, 2.5 million extra people in unemployment. And the only way that this will begin to be undone, and for South Africa to avert a sovereign debt crisis in the coming years, and a huge additional increase in poverty and suffering in our country, is if we focus with single-minded clarity on the growth agenda. And that means wide-ranging economic reform. None of these things are easy. If they were easy, they would be done already. But the president was elected on a reform mandate. He has repeatedly and in volume, in dozens of locations and occasions, repeated his commitment to these reforms. And yet progress has been so painfully slow. And that is why we are trying to up the ante in whatever way we can to pressurize and hold the government to account on this reform agenda. And so that said, let me get into the statement that we've prepared today and take you through it. The DA's economic structural reform tracker shows that South Africa is currently on a 73% deficit on economic reform progress. Today, ladies and gentlemen, marks exactly 508 days since President Cyril Ramaphosa delivered his presidential inauguration speech at the Union Buildings, in which he called for, in his words, an economic compact to drive growth and economic opportunity. Since then, however, the country and the economy has continued its downward trajectory, with the unemployment rate reaching an unprecedented all-time high after lockdown. When COVID hit our shores early this year, it delivered the final blow to an economy that was already in deep crisis due to years of policy inertia and entrenched structural problems. The 51% annualized quarter-on-quarter GDP contraction announced by Stats SA last month was a wake-up call to the undeniable fact that we can no longer afford to delay the implementation of a much-needed, far-reaching economic structural reform package. The devastation brought on by the lockdown has forced the government's hand now. And so in recent weeks, we have seen some reluctant but very welcome progress on some reforms. And that's why we say a 73% deficit on progress. But a more wide-ranging structural reform program has become imperative, not just to grow the economy, but to save it from further destruction. Several warnings have been issued by bodies such as the IMF and rating agencies that unless South Africa embarks on urgent reform program, the country's economic crisis will only worsen. Now, later this week, the president is himself going to be releasing yet another plan, the Economic Recovery Action Plan, when he addresses Parliament in a joint sitting on Thursday. And this plan has been touted as a blueprint to fast-track urgent structural reforms and stimulate economic growth. But as I've said in my introductory comments, South Africa does not need new plans. We have an embarrassment of plans. We have a surfeit of plans. What we need is for those plans and for the many often repeated promises to be implemented, for progress to be made on those reforms. And that requires the political will from the president and his allies inside his party to take on the difficult decisions, to take on the opponents of growth and reform in his party and make headway. Today, we are taking the first step to hold the president accountable to this commitment by introducing an economic reform tracker. The tracker's primary purpose will be to act as a progress assessment tool for economic reforms. In times past, the government's approach to reform has been simply to repeat the same plans and rhetoric over and over again with zero implementation. The reform tracker is a tool that shines the spotlight on the implementation deficit that has so far characterized the government's approach to reform. And it is this implementation deficit that is the key stumbling block holding back our economy's recovery now. In a few moments, we're going to upload the reform on our website for you to see. The tracker will use a 5-key score weighting system, with 1 representing the lowest score on reform progress and 5 representing the highest score, where a structural reform policy has been adopted and its impact measured. Using this weighting system, the tracker will measure progress on economic reform on 5 thematic areas, namely public finance reform, energy sector reform, state-owned enterprise reform, fighting corruption, labor market reform, and sectoral reforms. Using this tracker's methodology, the DA's initial assessment has shown that out of the 15 reform areas being tracked, 73% are still yet to move beyond the rhetoric or conceptualization stage. In other words, there has been absolutely zero progress on 73% of the government's reform promises. This means that most of the commitments by various government officials and leaders to pursue these reforms have not been met with any corresponding plan of action over the last 2 years. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Dion George to talk about our public finances, because none of the other reforms are really possible or will be effective if we cannot get our public finances back on track. Dion.
Thanks very much, Jordan. On the public finance reform, progress on reform is minimal and it scores the lowest possible score. Before COVID-19, our economy was already in crisis and expected to grow by 1%. That was significantly below the other developing economies. Our budget deficit was 371 billion rand and net loan debt was heading to 4.15 trillion rand, or 67% of GDP by 2020, 2023. With the COVID disruption, our economy is expected to contract by 7.2% in 2020. With significant declines in tax revenue, the budget deficit is growing and debt service costs are expected to be 236 billion rand. This is not sustainable, and Minister Mboweni has fairly accurately identified this problem, although his actual response is to borrow more money to pay for government expenditure. The minister talks about reform that is needed to improve our growth potential and competitiveness, and government creating an enabling regulatory environment. He also talks about the presidency and the National Treasury accelerating structural reform, but nothing is happening. If government focused on stabilizing the national debt and rationalized the public sector wage bill, public finance can be reformed. On the national debt stabilization, the Minister and National Treasury have raised alarm on how South Africa's public finances have become dangerously overstretched without any action to correct this. The DA has initiated a private members bill, the Fiscal Responsibility Bill, that would set legislative limits on how much government can borrow each year. This will keep debt levels and debt service costs under control. On the public sector wage bill, Minister Mboweni committed to cut 160 billion rand over the next 3 years. But the public sector unions don't agree, and government appears unable to withstand union pressure. The DA will make submissions during the medium-term budget policy statement process this month, and also during the national budget in February 2021. Our 3 proposals are to freeze the salaries of all managers and administrators and reduce the 29,000 millionaire managers in the public service by 1/3. A hiring freeze on all management positions, that's non-OSD levels 11 to 16, until the number of managers is reduced by 1/3. And finally, freezing the wages of the 33.7% of public servants not covered by the occupation-specific dispensation. This includes highly paid head office managers and supervisors. Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you very much, Dion. And I want to ask Caleb to come in. Certainly the other major constraint to growth and recovery in South Africa is, of course, the condition, the very parlous condition of our state-owned enterprises. Caleb.
Thank you, Jordan. As Jordan and Dion have quite correctly said, reform is of the order of the day, but this reform needs to be actionable, and it has been woefully not actionable in the past. So what we are clear on is that in the sector, in the energy sector and in Eskom and state-owned enterprises in general, if there is no actionable reform that fixes the mess that they're in, there will be no economic growth. And if there's no economic growth, then the lights go off in South Africa in no uncertain terms across the board. Now, what we intend to do is commend the government for gazetting the Section 34 determinations, which will allow the procurement of some 12,000 megawatts of electricity. But we want to ensure that this is fast-tracked and that the necessary requests for proposals and to open the next bid window for renewables is done without haste. We will monitor this in terms of our tracker and push it. In terms of Eskom reform, energy needs to be affordable and available. Sadly, that's not the case in either category. Maintenance is sadly lacking, and there is no particular addressing of the base load which keeps the lights on in the interim, let alone any fast tracking of the implementation of self-generation projects and the necessary licenses that are required in this regard. Now, this is all in the integrated resource plan, and we are aiming not only to push through what we think is necessary, but also to ensure that the government, at the very least, does what it says it would do. So that needs to be done, and that includes the release of the RFPs for the next bid window of independent power producers. Also, we need to speed up the generation, for the allowing of generation of electricity at private residences for own consumption. And in terms of this, we have certain proposals in this regard, in terms of rebates for solar energy and certain tax rebates to allow people to move. In terms of state-owned enterprises in general, transparency and accountability is absolutely key and has been woefully not present. So we have tabled a public finance management amendment bill, which will go an extraordinarily long way to ensuring that these basics, which should have been in place, simply like ensuring that financials are produced and tabled at the correct time, and if they're not, there are consequences, which have never been. These need to be addressed, and we will ensure that this happens. There's the overarching issue of debt. Eskom alone has a touted debt figure of some 488 billion, quite understated, because actually it's in the realms of the upper 700s if you take off-balance sheet debt into consideration and the deferred cost of required maintenance. Now, the only way that can be unlocked is by separation, as government is intended to do, of the entity into generation, transmission, and distribution, but has not done and has delayed. We want to ensure that this is on track, because it is only in the separation of these entities in this particular fashion that private-public partnerships can be brought to bear in the generation capacity. Transmission, which is in all probability going to be the most profitable area, can move independently, and distribution can be addressed with the parlous state of municipalities who don't pay for, in large measure, for the energy that they consume. I won't even begin to speak of SAA, which is utterly bankrupt and either, as we've said repeatedly, needs to either be liquidated forthwith or sold off. We will oppose government's own reluctance to stated reluctance or Treasury stated reluctance to put another 10 odd billion into the pot. These death spirals of these entities have to be watched with an eagle eye, and that's what we intend to do. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caleb. So I hope, folks, that you can see from what Caleb and Dion have said that this is not just about trying to embarrass the government. It really is a proactive tool to hold the government accountable for the promises they've made. And we are not just stopping there. We are going further to say we will actually put on the table proactive action steps like a private members bill in both the cases that Dion and Caleb have mentioned to actually drive this reform to the front of the agenda and make sure that it gets a proper hearing in Parliament and that we do what we can to support this reform agenda. Also, where the government does make legitimate and genuine progress, as Caleb has said in the publishing of those Section 34 determinations, we will happily update our reform tracker and give credit where it's due, because we are passionate about the reform agenda. We understand how important and vital this is for our economy and to get people back into work. And so we wanted to succeed. We really, really wanted to succeed. We feel very strongly about this. And that is why we are launching this tracker today. So I'm going to ask our colleague Innocent Lemuramba, I think he's on the line. I don't see him. Innocent, if you could please put up share the live link from our website to the tracker.
Okay.
If you could share that. Innocent, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm putting it up now. Just a moment.
Right.
Can you see?
Okay. I can see. I hope everyone else can see. So colleagues, there on our website, you will find a link to this tracker. And if you could just scroll down to give people an idea of what it looks like. And that is how it will look on our website. And you can see most of those are still 1 out of 5. That is the lowest possible score. That is because they are still at the stage of rhetoric and promise making with 0 progress made in implementation. And some of them are slightly higher at 2 or 3, for example, where Caleb has spoken about the gazetting of those regulations. I won't go through all of the reform areas one by one. That'll take too long, but I do invite you to peruse this document in your own time and at your own leisure. But suffice to say that we have tried to be as comprehensive as possible. All of the necessary structural reforms that are contained in the government's plans and in our own, and importantly, on which, as I said at the beginning, there is quite broad agreement in South Africa about most of these reform items, and yet there is still very, very slow progress. Now, if you'll excuse me, my daughter is calling me. I will be back in a second, but Dion, if you could just manage it for 1 minute, I'll be back right.
I will just take over where Jordan left off. If we have a look at the tracker, the tracker is divided up very simply into various sections, and the first section is basically the public finance reform. We've evaluated the overall scores, as you will see, on a scale of 1 to 5, and public financial reform is scored at a 1. The subsection on that is the national debt stabilization. As I mentioned earlier on, that is definitely not on track, although we do have proposals for the bill to a private member's bill to take over. I see Jordan is here. Jordan, would you like to take over? I've just started speaking about the subsections on the public finance reform. Would you like to carry on? I'm at 1.2.
Thanks so much, Dion. That's the joys of doing Zoom meetings from home, is that sometimes there are disruptions. So I really apologize for that, but my daughter was calling me because there was someone at the door. So sorry for that interruption, but all I was saying was that for most of these reform items, they are still on number one out of 5, that's 20%, because they're still at the stage of mere promises without any progress being actually made on implementation. And if we just quickly go through the 15 areas, you'll see there's energy sector reform, IPPs, and for each one, if you just stop there, for example, Innocent on IPPs, you will see that there's a problem statement, there's a recognition of government's progress there, that is why that one is reflected as a 3 out of 5, and there is a DA action plan for each one of these things. That's why I was saying it's not just about holding the government to account, it's also about proactively trying to help push this to the front of the agenda. And the same is true for each one of the 15 areas on this reform tracker. So this will be updated regularly as and when there is progress. And all of these DA action plans will be actioned in Parliament as soon as is possible. So you can peruse that at your own leisure. And Caleb and Dion, if you don't have anything else to add, then we can go to questions. Okay. Colleagues, if there are any questions, I'm afraid I can't see raised hands, so I'm going to, Innocent or Bongisa, if you could just let me know if there's questions. I'm not the host.
At the moment, colleagues, there are no raised hands, but you are welcome to also include your questions via the chat. So you can add whatever questions you will have on the chat or by raising the virtual hand.
Okay, well, the statement is quite self-explanatory and goes into a lot more detail. And that's why we haven't gone through all of that in this press conference, but most of you are regularly in touch with me anyway. And it's really nice to see you on our press conference, and thank you once again for your time. And you are welcome to contact me privately or Dion or Caleb about this. Otherwise, to make use of our statement, and the statement has gone out with sound bites attached for radio. So thank you very much for your time. If there are no other questions, then Bongisa, are there any questions?
There are no questions. I think it has been clear.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your attendance and have a great day.